So a while back, I had a tutorial about trying to remove mic bleed from podcast recordings. And that was centered around using sidechain compression in a DAW. I was using Logic. I still use Logic. It works. There was some comments asking, what do you do if there's more than two people on the episode? So more than two people in the same room? Or how do you, try to control if someone is interjecting while the other person's talking? How does the compressor react if somebody kind of butts in? Does it lose some of the control and introduces the mic bleed again? And it is not a perfect solution, that's for sure. So what we've been doing the past year or two is a different workflow using iZotope RX, which is an advanced audio editor. I have RX9. They might be on RX10 or even 11 at this point. But there's a lot of tools in here for repairing and cleaning up audio. And the one that we're going to talk about today is debleed, which removes the bleed of other sound sources that are coming into a microphone. So in a recording studio environment, this might be a click track that someone has going through their headphones that is maybe a little too loud and ends up bleeding into the microphone. In the podcast realm, which is what we're going to be talking about, this is what we're using now to remove mic bleed if there's multiple people recording in one space. And what we're going to do first is cover this scenario with three people on a podcast. So we're going to imagine that there's three people recording on one show. They're all in the same space, and their microphones are kind of intermingled. They're close enough together that we have mic bleed coming into the mics. The reason I want to do this with three instead of with just two people, which is a typical like host and guest, is three makes things more tricky because typically we have the host microphone and we want to remove the guest bleeding into it. And then we have the guest microphone and we want to inversely remove the host from bleeding into it. But when there's three, that extra element means that there's possibly two voices coming into one mic for bleed that we have to kind of rectify. So I'm going to talk about this with three people. If you bring this down one level and only have two people on the episode, the thought process is the same. I'll explain the one step that's different, but the concept is going to be the same. So I have footage here. It's a 3-camera setup, and the audio was recorded directly to camera. So I'm going to drag in B and C camera into Logic Pro, let that extract the audio source from the camera footage. All right, so this has been dropped in. Now, in this scenario, this is not related to mic bleed, but because I do have two audio sources recorded into the same camera, one on the left channel, one on the right channel, I will talk about how I extract this. So Bcam is one voice. It appears in stereo, but it is just one voice. So in Logic, I will change this channel to mono. So if I just click this little source next to where my input and output is, I can go from mono to stereo, left, right, etc. So this is now a mono source, even though you see the region still has two channels. The channel in Logic is coming out as mono. So when I export it, it will still be in mono. And then for CCam, I'm going to first just duplicate this region. So hold Option and drag this down to change or to copy it. And then I'm going to set one to the left channel and one to the right channel. So in the same button here next to the input, instead of selecting just mono, I can select the specific channel. So I'll go left for this. I'll go right for this. And now we have three voices. So usually what I'll do here is I'll just say Bcam, I'll say Ccam left and Ccam right. Because I don't know who these people are yet. I haven't listened to it, but we'll just start with that. Okay, I just did a little trimming on the front and back of this. This is why it looks different. Quick, just check in about the setup that I'm using in this project. I have a template project that I use if I'm extracting audio sources from camera footage, where I need to basically just pull out the raw audio recording and export it before I start doing any processing on it. It's basically just a blank template in Logic, but there is one important thing. This only applies if your podcast does have video footage, but one thing that we need to check for before we start syncing the footage and start to process everything is that the audio and the video are going to match up when they're put together. What I mean by that is, depending on the frame rate, the bit rate of the video versus the bit rate and sample rate of the audio need to match. So all these were recorded in 48K. I know that because I know what the hardware is that they're recording on, so I don't have to worry about that. But I do need to check what the frame rate is, and I want Logic to be set to the same frame rate, even though there's no video in Logic, so that I have no qualms when I export this and drop it into Final Cut or Premiere that it's going to be misaligned from the original video. So what I do is I just double check what the frame rate of the video is. You can just click Command-I on the Mac to get info. I have a free app called mediainfo.app, which I usually pull up. It gives you more information about the footage. And I just check a couple important things. One, I want to know what the frame rate is, 23.976, also known as 23.98. That's good. I want to know that it's a constant frame rate because there is variable frame rate, which means it changes over the course of the video to try to adapt to the data that's coming through the video feed, which isn't a wrong thing per se, but when we're syncing audio to the video, it does cause sync issues, where if the audio is recorded for a certain length, the video is recorded for a certain length, but the frame rate is variable, it makes it hard to line those up because there's going to be it's going to be off by a couple frames by the end of the project. So the fact that it's in constant frame rate that makes everything easier. If it were variable, I would have to transcode it. I can talk about that in a separate video. But these are the most important things: frame rate, and then is it variable or constant? I already know what the audio profile is, but I also it's good to check that the sample rate of the audio is 48K. Most things that have a video capability, like a camera or an app that records video, is going to record the audio at 48K. Most of the time, 99% of things that have video always recording 48K, but it's good to double check. Okay, so in Logic, I'm going to set my frame rate. So File, Project Settings, Synchronization. And because you can put video in Logic, there is an option to change the frame rate so that you know what you're working with if you were to put a video track in here and align audio to match it. We're not going to do that now, but I still want to make sure the frame rate is correct. So my frame rate, I'm going to change to 23.976, which is good. And then I have Snap is on. Snap means that it's going to, when you move regions, it's going to lock them based on either the BPM of the project or the frame rate of the project. You can also do samples, which is obviously, we don't need to worry about that right now. So I have my snap is set to frames, and I have it set to absolute value. The difference here is, so relative value, say that this was, the starting point of this region was like halfway through a frame. It was at like 23.2 frames. If I were to move it a frame over, it wouldn't jump to the next second, which would be the 24th frame. It would go to 24.2, or at that point, it would be frame 1.2 of the next second. Absolute, which is what I use in this case, is always going to be based on whatever the project time is set up. It's always going to lock it to the actual frame based on the time code of the project. So if I try to move it in the middle of a frame, it won't let me. Like if I zoom in here, you can see the grid. These ticks here are set up to represent every single frame. Like for example, here's 10 seconds. Here's 11 seconds. And there are 23 of these little ticks in between that 1 second gap that represent every single frame if there was a video attached. So it won't let me put this in the middle of a frame. I actually I want to take it all the way back to 10. And in this case, since I trimmed something, I'm actually going to take it all the way back to return to 0 at the end. So the reason I explain all that, I know that was kind of long-winded, is to make sure that the start and the end point of these files match, and that they're not starting or ending in the middle of a frame, because when you get the video in there, the video cannot be physically cannot be like a partial frame. It's because there's, a certain amount of pictures happening every second. That's what the frame rate represents. So if the audio was starting at, like a half a frame in, it would be right at the beginning of the project. It would just be off sync from the video. And it's a bit difficult to change it unless you change the audio first. So I have this project ending at 1 hour, 9 minutes, 23 seconds, and 16 frames. Now, sometimes what I will do, I know there's a lot of dead air at the end of recordings. They'll stop and then they'll like the conversation will end and then they'll chit chat a little bit before the recording itself actually stops. So because there's dead air at the end, stuff that we don't actually need, I will sometimes take this back to just a rounded off second instead of frames. So right here, I'm going to have it end at 1 hour, 9 minutes, 23 seconds, and 0 frames. So I know it's more of a clean break and it makes it easier to line things up in your video editor, Premiere, Final Cut, whatever you decide to use. All right, and then I'm going to move this project end marker to match. This is also, by the way, when you have the snap on, your cursor will move based on the value that you have snap set to. The regions will shift to that value. If you set locators to do an export like this, that will always snap to that value. And if you set the end project marker, that will also snap to that value. So once you have that set, it pretty much guarantees that everything's going to be in line as long as you're paying attention to the start and the end point, and then you have the snap on the whole time. Okay, now we can get to exporting. So what I do is 2 steps here. I need a file, an individual file for each of these 3 voices because they were originally on video footage. I want to extract that and make sure that I have audio footage. So I'm going to take these 3. And what we do is Command-Shift-E in Logic is export all tracks as audio files. This exports the regions that are there, and it does not include any of I guess you can select to include the plugins, not include the plugins. I don't have any effects running on these right now as part of this project template. It's just blank because I'm tweaking and processing the audio in a different step. This is just to get it aligned with the correct start and end point. So I want it in this folder. The range is going to be extend file length to project end. So trim silence means once it detects that, like say my end locator was further back and there was just blank there, Logic would try to detect when the audio file actually ends and trim it to that point. Export cycle range would be if I had set locators, like if I set a locator for this 5-minute gap, it would only export what's in there. But what we want is extend file length to project end. I'm going to leave it a wave. It's going to stay 24-bit. I'm going to turn normalize off. Bypass effect plugins is off. I don't need audio tail, volume information, tempo information. All this is checked off. And then I can export. I've already exported these, so I'm going to skip that for a second. One thing I just did want to explain, sometimes you'll be dealing with files of different lengths, and perhaps this is an entirely different video, but the reason that we export all the way to the end of the project is because say you had somebody that, joins the podcast halfway through or joins the call halfway through, or there's multiple guests and, you have one talking for 30 minutes and then the other person's talking for 30 minutes. Well, when I get these lined up, even though this is 30 minutes of just nothing, it's just blank, I know that this needs to line up with this audio track, this speaker, which is the entire length of the podcast. And same thing here. This is the first 30 minutes of the show. The rest of it is blank, but I still want to make sure that is the full length of this main track. This is kind of like my master track here in the audio. Everything needs to be the exact same start and end point. So if I were to export with, trim silence after audio file, this would only be 30 minutes long. It would not be 1 hour and 10. And that would cause problems. And then this one would also be 30 minutes long. And it would seem like it started here instead of at the 0 marker of the project. So I we run the export all the way to the end of the project. That's why I always define where this end marker is for the project. I define that it has to be back there. It looks like I moved it by accident. That way, this audio file, all three of them are going to be the exact same length. So I hope that makes sense. All right. Put these back. Just triple check that this stayed. Yes. Okay. Export. All right. So once that is finished, I have 3 files, WAV files. They're named off of the name of the tracks in Logic, and they're all exactly the same size and length. Okay, so the next step for debleed. Here is where there's one caveat. If there's just 2 people on the show, you can skip this step. But if there's 3 or more, what we're going to do next is make sure that we have something that debleed can learn from where the mic bleed is coming in. So what I mean by that is I have Bcam here. When you can see the region, the waveform in the region up here. Let's crank this up. So there's a whole gap here where he's not talking, right? There is potential mic bleed coming in not only from this guest, but also from this guest. So when we move over to RX and I train it to figure out where the mic bleed is, I want it to be recognizing both of these voices, not just one voice. So what we do next is I will mute this track and I'm going to export another dry audio sync that combines CCAM left and right. So this is only used to run the debleed, and then we don't need it anymore. So, and I'm just going to call this, for this I have to bounce because it's the 2 tracks together. I don't want individual tracks. I want these combined. So I'm going to bounce this wave, also 24-bit 48K, and I'm just going to call this C left and C right. I'm going to let that do its thing. Okay, so here's that track, C left, C right. You notice how it's a stereo track, so it's double the length of these, or double the size of these, sorry, but it's still the exact same length because of where we set the locators to. Okay, now we're going to do 2 more of these because we want to make sure that, again, for every single mic, where we have a track that is acting as the bleed source for that microphone. So what we just did is the reference track for Bcam. Now we want the reference track for CCAM left. So I'm going to mute that, unmute B, and we're going to do the same thing. And I'll just call this Bcam and C right and drop this in the same folder. All right, we have that here. And then we're following the same process. I'm going to mute this last track. Same thing. And this would be B-C left. Okay. And as we're organizing footage, we can put these in different folders so that we don't mix them up. For my dry audio syncs that haven't been treated yet, I usually call those aligns. And then I'll make something that says for debleed. And then we can put the video footage somewhere too. So we'll drop video here. For the tracks that are my dry syncs, put them in aligns. And then these references for the debleed only will go here. All right, so now I got 6 tracks that we're dealing with. So I can get rid of Logic now, save and exit. And then we have iZotope RX here. So I'm going to drag and drop all of these audio files in. We want all 6 loaded in to the app that we can process. And you can see the 6 of these up here. Looks like some of them are still loading in. Okay. So B cam, we're going to start here. What we want to do is identify a spot where this person's not talking and they're getting bleed from both of the other microphones. And we're going to open dBleed in RX and we're going to train it to learn what the bleed sounds like so it can take it out of the rest of the track. So I'm going to pick a random spot. We're going to zoom in. I want to check here too. I hope you can hear this. I set the RX to output to the Loom recording. If you can't hear this, what I'm doing is basically I want to find a spot in the episode where both of the other guests are talking and kind of like trading off a little bit. Once I do, and I can tell that this is like the quieter section. Obviously, the host is talking into the mic when you see the waveform like this, and this is much quieter. So I'm going to grab this whole section. We're going to open dBleed, which is a module inside RX. And we're going to set a couple quick things and we'll be almost done. So the track that I'm working on is B-Cam. It tells you what the active track is here. And then it asks you to select a source track for the bleed. So this is where those extra exports come in handy. So if I'm removing the bleed from B, I want the reference that's coming from C-Cam left and right. And I'm going to click Learn. I'm just going to analyze this segment of audio. And we'll be ready to render this out. Okay, and then I can preview. So it's playing back this same segment, and it's showing me what it sounds like with the bleed active. As it's playing back, I can bypass. So you can kind of identify back and forth. Now, notice this is not 100% silent. So, but this is removing the bleed so much that once we put a noise reduction on this or an expander to remove the low sounds that are coming through the track, that's actually going to eliminate this, as opposed to if we were just relying on what it sounds like without the mic bleed. Those other voices can sometimes get loud enough that will interfere with the expander or interfere with the sidechain, and it will kind of mess up. You'll hear those voices pop back into the audio, which is not what we want. Okay, so once you're, I also should say you can change the reduction strength. So this is how much it's going to try to squash the bleed, and you can change the smoothing, which you kind of have to, based on the recordings, the mics that were used, the talent, and the location that you were in. You might have to play with this to see what is the right setting for your recordings. Because as it squashes that bleed, it introduces what's called artifacts, which you might have heard a little bit. It's kind of like a warbly sound. Let's see. It's kind of like a higher pitch. There's like some overtones. Those are called artifacts of it trying to repair the audio. So you can adjust and try to smooth those out as much as possible. The settings that have worked for me are usually between 4 and 5 for artifact smoothing and full reduction strength. So once you're happy with that, click back here where your region is, Command A to select the entire file before you start rendering dBleed, because note we zoomed in. So if you just run it here, it's only going to process this small section. Make sure you Command A, and then in the dBleed module, hit Render. And the only downside to dBleed, I would say, is that it does take some time to render this out. This is a Mac Mini with silicon, so it's a little faster, but I remember on my Intel MacBook Pro, sometimes dBleed for an hour-long recording would take 20 to 30 minutes. And then obviously we have 3 tracks, so we have to do that 3 times. So we render, we process, we export. That's about 30 minutes. Then we do the next track, and we repeat that for as many tracks as we have. So I'm going to let this render. We'll do the same thing with the other 2, and then we'll be done. All right, so we got all of those rendered out. Just followed the same exact process for the other 2. Now it'll be time to mix these guys. drop them all into Logic and do the typical processing that we do just to get it ready before the edit. That's all a separate video. So hopefully that was helpful. If you've been having issues with mic bleed on your podcasts, can't quite get those extra interfering voices out of the other microphones, I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions or run into any issues with the workflow or want to explore this more, please leave a comment below and I will get back to everyone as quickly as I can. Thanks.